Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us here at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine's meeting on the Mesa. We're pleased to have been invited to have a very interesting discussion with you here today. We're going to talk about similarities, differences, and interactions between the different stages of biotech investing. Representing early stage seed funding is Debra Miller, the CEO and founder of CureDuchenne, who has demonstrated great success in venture philanthropy. I will be covering the early to mid-stage segment of largely private investing. I'm Jason Rhodes, a partner at Atlas Venture. And on the topic of public investments, we have Rajiv, Kaul, portfolio manager from Fidelity Investments. I'll now ask Debra and Rajiv, maybe starting with Debra, to introduce yourself in just a little bit more detail and tell us more about your firm and how you entered venture investing and your overall strategy.
Great. Thanks, Jason, for inviting us. So CureDuchenne was founded in 2003 by my husband, Paul, and myself when our son, Håkon, was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And we didn't know anything about the disease or science. And we were fortunate enough to very early on take on a venture philanthropy model all the way back in 2004. It made sense to us that if we were going to be giving money to commercial organizations, that if there was a potential for a return, that CureDuchenne would be able to participate in that return so that we could further invest in subsequent investments. And so along the way, we've created a lot of different programs. CureDuchenne Cares program, which is education and outreach for families. We have a biobank, and we've become a very comprehensive organization, but still the research is a very significant part of what we do at CureDuchenne.
That's terrific. And Rajiv, maybe you could tell us more about yourself and Fidelity's investments in biotech.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me, Debra and Jason. Fidelity, as most people know, is among the largest institutional investors in the world. Within biotech, that's also the case as well. I manage the biotech fund at Fidelity. It's my 25th year here. Prior to that, I was at Harvard. And through the course of these last 25 years, I guess we've been fortunate to see the evolution of the biotech industry from really one based on hopes and dreams to a better understanding of the causation of disease and some of the fundamental drivers of disease like DMD, for example. And so I think we're at an important critical point in the evolution of the industry where a lot of these forces around fundamental drug discovery, the explosion of validated targets, new ways to deliver safe medicines have really come together in this moment. And Fidelity and our shareholders have been fortunate to be part of this amazing period. It's a great business to invest in because if you're successful, to do a lot of amazing things for patients and society, and you can also generate terrific returns for investors. Investing in biotech has been among the sectors within the S&P 500 that had among best returns in the last 2 decades. As we look forward to the next period, over the next 3 to 5 years and 10 years, I think there's reason to be very optimistic that these fundamental trends will only converge further. And I'm very hopeful that that not only the investment, that the scientists and the investors, when they come together, can really deliver some really great breakthrough medicines for patients and for society. It's not an easy industry to invest in. One has to be always concerned about risk, while the hope for the industry is always very high, obviously, given that we're tackling really major areas of a high unmet need. There's also a high risk of failure in the clinic, where taking scientific unknowns and trying to translate that in the clinic, which is also often full of a lot of unknowns. So one has to be very careful in making the right investments, but if you're able to do it successfully, as I said earlier, this could be a very lucrative and fulfilling area to invest in.
That's great. Well, thank you both for joining us and for those introductions. Let me briefly tell everyone about Atlas and what we do. As I mentioned, I'm a partner here at Atlas. Atlas has been investing in early stage biotech innovation since the early 1990s. And we are a venture firm, and we focus exclusively on therapeutics. So across therapeutic areas, across modalities. You know, that said, and apropos in particular of CureDuchenne, we've been fairly active in the neuromuscular disease space across a range of indications, including Duchenne's. Atlas's strategy is really seed first and science led. And as Rajiv suggested, early stage biotech investing and biotech investing more broadly remains a risky venture investment approach. And so with our seed strategy, we actually will put very focused dollars behind critical early initial experiments to try to figure out which ones can be advanced with the greatest likelihood of success versus which ones we should stop. And in doing that, we're founding, seeding, and incubating actually most of the companies that we invest in. When we launch new companies, we always are founding them and then leading their seed and also their Series A investments. We work with a variety of other early stage venture firms. As companies progress, we work with later stage participants in the capital markets, including large public mutual funds like Fidelity. And of course, we also work with disease foundations like CureDuchenne. And I think, again, as was suggested, we are in a remarkable time in biotech, which has really changed quite dramatically over the past 10 years in terms of the nature of the science, the therapeutic modalities that we can bring to bear. In Duchenne's, we have an approved exon skipping product as an example, but also in terms of the abundance of capital. The amount of capital that's now available to fund biotech innovation is dramatically greater than it was previously. And 2020, contrary, I think, to many expectations perhaps, has continued that trend. There have been, I think, 45 IPOs year to date, around $11 billion raised through those IPOs. And there's been a similar level of activity upstream in the private venture markets. That level of activity, to some extent, in the public markets can obscure all of the early stage funding that's so important to sort of planting the seeds that can grow up and then become these later stage public companies. And so with that as background, Debra, maybe I'll turn back to you and you could tell us some more about what are your criteria? How do you think about investments? How do you identify them? How do you choose the ones to support? And maybe as part of that, what is the role of CureDuchenne and CureDuchenne Ventures over time in the life cycle of each of the companies that you invest in?
Great, thanks, Jason. So we obviously are focused on Duchenne muscular dystrophy treatments and therapeutics and ancillary type programs. We are out scouting a lot, looking for new technologies, and we have the advantage of being able to focus very narrowly on our particular disease area. And so because of that, we go very, very deep in one disease area and have been able to attract a group of experts within our organization that we kind of consider our secret weapons in terms of not only having the biological understanding of the disease, but also coming from biotech and pharma organizations that have the drug development expertise. That's something that has been lacking a lot within nonprofit organizations as they put together their scientific evaluation teams, is that the science can be really, really interesting, but if you can't turn it into a therapeutic or a drug or deliver it or manufacture it, then it's a problem. And so by bringing on drug development experts really early on, we're able to avoid some of the pitfalls where the science looked really great, but it couldn't go anywhere. And so we work really closely with a lot of not only organizations like Atlas to kind of, run ideas past and collaborate on potential ideas, but also we have our PhDs that are out looking all over the place for new projects. Lately, a lot more companies are coming to us in a very early stage, and what we're seeing is what used to be a scientific project at academic institutions are now becoming early stage biotech companies. And so what we are very conscious of is that not only does it take really good science, but it takes really good team also. So we are, when we invest in a company very early on, many times they, obviously love the investment that we're making as a nonprofit organization early, but they also really appreciate the expertise that we're bringing in terms of the knowledge of the disease, the knowledge of the patient population, regulatory issues and such as it pertains to this particular disease. So we're not specific to any particular stage. We do like to come in quite early so that we can hopefully provide expertise and make sure that things move quickly in the right direction. But we're not opposed to looking at companies a little bit later, Series A, or sometimes even beyond there.
That's great. And you raised a whole bunch of really interesting themes. One of them that resonates with me among all of them is that notion of the translational expertise.
Mm-hmm.
We have access to a tremendous amount of science and biological insight into many of these diseases, including DMD today. And often success or failure, at least from an Atlas perspective, comes down to not so much the quality of the science in the sense that there's a lot of good science there and we have access to it collectively and are able to assess it, but can we really put together the teams and the people, because it turns out teams are made up of people who really know how to advance the science, and not just in terms of the earliest discovery stage activities, but all the way through preclinical development into early translational clinical development, and then what becomes regulatory clinical development, and ultimately commercialization. And as we start companies and we think about access to the networks of thought leaders in the disease areas, and then also, you mentioned regulatory, for example, that access is critical to our companies. And, we've worked with you and you've invested in at least one of our companies called Dyne. And from an Atlas perspective, I think the relationship with disease foundations like yours is so important, not only for the capital funding, and in that sense, the sort of endorsement that you provide early on, but for access to that sort of expertise, the networks of people, and absolutely not least a patient perspective that's extremely useful for us. It's very useful for us in I think, a more sort of technical way sometimes to think about what should the real product profile look like, how will it be used in a clinical setting. So there's sort of a scientific and kind of clinical point of view that's brought to us, but also just access to the patients and their families and how they think about and live with these diseases. And I know that, for our companies, that's extremely motivational and really gives them a very genuine sense of purpose for the kind of work that they're doing. So Rajiv, maybe we'll turn to you. So there's all of this early stage biotech investing. It's all fantastic. It's all going to be very successful. And all these companies sort of show up on your doorstep, whether literally or not, and say, hey, we want to be public companies. So how do you think about looking upstream and figuring out which companies you want to engage with and invest in over time?
Yeah. As you know, Jason, we invest across the whole continuum of the industry. And I spend a lot of my time, bulk of my time, on the larger, more profitable companies that are later stage, but a lot of it is also spent in the very early stages of product development and company development and in academia, because that's where the future is moving towards. And it's very important whether we invest in those companies or not to be ahead of the curve and to understand where the science is going. My concern a little bit is when you have periods of, I note your comment early on is from my perspective, is certainly positive that there's a lot of capital going into the biotech sector, and we need that because there's a lot of diseases that need treatments. At the same time, from an investment perspective, you want to be buying low, and you want to not get caught up in the hype. And biotech, from an investment perspective, I think because the fundamental nature of this industry is hope and disappointment, can often get caught up in euphoric moments and then desperate moments. And so I like to be contrarian in the way I invest in these companies. I would say I'm generally looking for breakthrough drugs in areas of very high unmet medical need, with strong scientific rationale and high barriers to entry. Because one of the other challenges of having a lot of capital coming into the sector is that people can do the same. There's going to be a second and third competitor coming to space very quickly, and it's increasingly important to understand barriers to entry. So, those are certain factors, and probability of success to me is always ranked among the top. The drug needs to work and be best in class. So I feel very fortunate that there's so many companies trying to raise money. There's a lot of great ideas, but you have to be very selective, pick the best ones with the highest barriers to entry, you know, biggest breakthrough benefits to patients in the areas of high unmet need, so that payers can justify the cost of some of these medicines, because they typically tend to be quite high. And that is, healthcare systems around the world are under a lot of economic pressure. And probability of success. You want the drugs to work. You want experienced management teams that have had success in the past, that understand how to navigate the treacherous clinical processes and the FDA and the regulatory agencies around the world, and be able to raise the right capital at the right cost. So it's the combination of all these different factors that come together, but it's all done in a bottoms-up, fundamental-driven analysis. I mean, what's unique about the biotech sector is each company is really different. Just like each disease is different in each patient with an N of 1, we're moving towards getting these very targeted patient-specific therapies. I think that's also reflected in the nature of these companies. And so you have to pick them one at a time and really understand the fundamentals on an individual company by company basis, and then build up the investment portfolio that way.
Actually, building on that theme, maybe, Debra, I think you may have wanted to add something.
No, it's just to I think your point, Jason, and also Rajiv, you know, when we go in really early, for us, you know, we have a double bottom line. So obviously the returns that we've been able to realize from successful investments have given us the funds to continue and invest and redeploy those funds. However, we go into it strictly with kind of agnostic blinders on, that all we care about early on is the science and, you know, is this drug going to work? And then after that, we stop and ponder about, you know, the potential financial return. But I think it's just really important for an organization like ours to take the risk out for, you know, Atlas and down the road for Fidelity, for example, by going in and investing in companies that you might not, or, you know, bigger companies or investment firms may not do that. And so I think that it's really, really important for us to remember that our job in the ecosystem is to hopefully tee up some wonderful deals for both of you coming out of there, and by taking the risk out of the science by the time you see it.
Yeah, you know, and one theme that I think you both touched on that maybe I'll sort of pose as a question of sorts is, you know, for many of these rare diseases, they have a genetic basis. That the genetic basis of the disease is increasingly well understood, very well understood, I think, in Duchenne's, and we understand the pathophysiology that kind of comes from that downstream. And so when we start thinking about therapeutic opportunities, we often think about, you know, one extreme is there's some notion of a complete cure that could be enabled through gene therapy. And then at the other extreme, we think of more sort of symptomatic sorts of therapies. And then there are lots of, I think, therapeutic approaches, you know, including antisense and exon skipping, et cetera, that maybe can have very profound benefit, but you might not consider to be permanent cures. For both of you, as you think about that huge range of therapeutic opportunities, how does that tie into your investment decision making, in the sense that I imagine it's very hard to predict on day one which one of them, or maybe which hopefully several of them, will make it through. So there's an assessment that happens at that level. And then I imagine there's another layer where you say, let me look 5 years ahead or 10 years ahead, when conceivably multiple products are approved, and think about how they could work together. And you are at different ends, I think, of the stage spectrum, but maybe you could each speak to that a little bit.
Sure, I'll start with the early stage. You know, I'll use a couple examples. For example, we invested in this little tiny biotech company called ABI Biopharma back in 2010 that later became Sarepta. And they were at a point where they were on clinical hold from the FDA, and they could not move forward with their clinical trials because they didn't have any money to do the next preclinical tox work that they had to do. And so we got together with another small organization in Washington, D.C., and provided the funding for them to actually do the clinical trial. And, you know, the rest is history. But it's because of really focusing on, you know, what we thought was going to be, you know, not the cure, obviously, but we also knew that we had to get something approved. And so, you know, and it's amazing that because of Sarepta's success, I think it's garnered a lot more attention into the Duchenne community, and especially in terms of investment dollars. And so very worthwhile our effort, even though it was a small contribution. It wasn't an equity investment, unfortunately, at that point. But it also goes to show that it wasn't just the amount of money that we contributed, but it was, speaking at the AdCom advisory board of the FDA, to let them know that, even a small percent of dystrophin is better than none. And I think that's where the patient perspective comes in, that if if you're missing a protein, you think you have to replace the whole thing to have functional improvement, where you don't. So that was obviously a success story. And then a couple other opportunities where we actually co-founded a company called Exonics Therapeutics with Dr. Eric Olson from UT Southwestern, and founded a CRISPR-based company that was sold within 2 years to Vertex. And that was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity, because Vertex has the power, I think, if anybody does, to take this and turn it into a therapeutic for Duchenne. Another small company, Bamboo Therapeutics, that we invested in very early, that was bought by Pfizer. And so, you can kind of see the progression of the public markets. And then most recently, we had a wonderful investment with Dyne Therapeutics, which was an Atlas company, and are looking forward to great success. And I think then again, it was an opportunity to explain to investors that you don't need 100% dystrophin, that a smaller amount of dystrophin is actually very beneficial. And so we're hopefully looking forward to a great success from Dyne, and who knows, possibly it'll be in your area sometime soon, Rajiv.
Yeah, that's awesome, Debra. I mean, we've talked over the last many years, and the work that you've done through CureDuchenne's, I think, certainly helped Sarepta. It's public information that we've been large shareholders for a long time. And I think your initial work there and confidence in the ability of this company and the science was very helpful in directing our attention to, initially when we made the investment, to actually look at the company. I think at the time people were quite skeptical about the whole approach, and even gene therapy was viewed as this failed experiment from the 90s. It's only recently, I think, with spinal muscular atrophy, another rare disease, and the VEXAS success, that I think Wall Street and the investment community broadly, and physicians, regulators, have begun to accept the promise of gene therapy. And my point here is, I think it's the work that foundations like CureDuchenne and others, the work that they're doing is so important, because it really spreads across the entire rare disease world. So CF Foundation and their investment in Vertex is another great example of that stamp of clinical and scientific approval, or at least direction, I think that investors need in the early stages of looking at these companies, when there's a lot of risks and unknowns. Having the confidence of the community is a big help. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about, Jason, to your question on how to deal with all the different modalities and how to address that question. I think that's one of the bigger challenges that's emerging in this space, and that's very positive for patients. I think it's very positive for the pricing dynamic for healthcare providers, because you have a more competitive environment, you'll get better pricing options. But I think from an investment perspective, I think it requires managing risk in a smarter way. I think, we were early investors in Avexis, and also owned Ionis and the antisense approach to treating the disease, as well as the small molecule approach. And I think the thought at the time, this is all public information, the thought at the time was that we'd begun to understand the genetic drivers and basis of the disease. We were unsure as what would be the best way to treat it, the best modality. But the likelihood of success of one or more of these modalities seemed quite high, and the world wasn't really believing in it or paying attention to it. And so the diversification and the risk management occurred a little bit on the portfolio management level. And often what happens with these therapies is that they can be combined. Different patients have different needs. So there's the potential to have multiple therapies to have a role in treating these diseases, as long as you're able to, again, deliver breakthrough treatment effects. And I think the very promising moment that we're in biotech is we sequenced the genome 20 years ago. I think it was we really began to, I think computational power didn't really have the memory to study one gene up until 2000, 2007, 2008. And now we're 15, 20 years later, and we're really making some very big strides towards curing a lot of monogenic diseases. And to me, that's very reassuring that this industry is capable of really coming up with transformative medicines that can really benefit patients. And my hope is that as we move further into more complex diseases, moving from towards polygenic diseases, that these learnings that have come from this process will help us tackle some of the big healthcare problems that all of us face.
Yeah,
I hope that's helpful. I hope that's helpful.
No, it is. And there's some very interesting, themes there. I mean, both of you, I think, alluded to the notion that I think in the 90s and early 2000s, a lot of what we were doing was really technology development around things like antisense or gene therapy or these other modalities. We may not have fully appreciated it at the time. We thought we were developing new drugs. But I think looking back from 2020, and after great success, so to be very certain to say that, I think what we can say is that we spent a couple of decades developing these technologies, and what we're really only now seeing in the past, I'll even say 5 years, maybe it's 10 years, is the intersection of those new modalities and this toolkit of technologies that we've created with the biological understanding. And in many cases, these new technologies are for very good and I think obvious reasons, first being applied to these rare, often monogenic diseases. And the historical view of some diseases where you develop one drug for one disease and it addresses it and you're kind of done and you declare victory and you look for the next disease. But I think even among these monogenic diseases, we're seeing, and certainly in some cases, that you really will have some sort of a polypharmacy, a kind of combination product approach, which you alluded to, Rajiv. And then as these tools are developed, we can start thinking about how we expand their use and apply them also to broader diseases that are maybe more common or viewed as more polygenic kinds of diseases. And, I've been in the industry like you guys since the early 90s. And it's very satisfying to see that development of these technologies. And maybe the one other point that I think you both made that I'll just kind of echo again is that these technologies have gone through sort of an arc and we're still ascending on that arc, but it's become quite usable and applicable. Companies similarly have life cycles and stages. And you talked about AVI, and I remember looking at that company kind of a million years ago before it was Sarepta, but it became Sarepta and it's a public company with approved products and it's a commercial company. And other companies like Exonics that were acquired. And so, the mission that we view ourselves as being engaged in at Atlas, and I think you both probably think about what you do in part, at least this way also, is our goal is to really translate science into products and then to develop those products to a certain point. And those companies may take them forward independently, as Sarepta has, but it also is still a real win, not only from an investment point of view, but also really for patients and society, if, as with Exonics, that technology ends up inside a larger company that has the means and the development capacity and all the organizational resources to continue to advance it. So, those kinds of outcomes are very attractive and very positive from our point of view as well. And maybe I'll transition a little bit to how both of you, and I guess also Atlas, think about kind of exits and where in the sort of investment life cycle we play. How long do you stay in an investment? Could you stay in an investment indefinitely? Do you always get out at a certain stage? And maybe we'll start with you again, Debra.
Right. So because we don't usually bring, relatively significant amount of money to the party, the exit isn't usually our decision. a lot of times the scientists don't understand exactly how much money it takes to actually conduct a clinical trial. And so there many times, the very tiny companies are in sticker shock when they start looking forward to, what they need to develop this drug. And so, again, we kind of go with the major investors. So I don't know that we have a clear strategy because, again, our money is a pretty small amount overall.
Do you have a goal? Do you have a preference for how companies exit or if they stay independent? And you may not, but.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. If it's a company that really needs a lot of work, as in the case of Exonics, we're thrilled when somebody like Vertex, a company like Vertex will acquire them because they have the means, the resources, the know-how, the networks and such to conduct this much faster than if the company was just to do an IPO and try and cobble together that team. But if it's a team that really has the expertise and they've been down this road before, then we're really excited to see them pursue it through an IPO and continue to keep the assets internal, because obviously that is a very nice cash infusion back to the nonprofit organization to continue funding other projects.
That's right. And you have an evergreen strategy and fund
Yes.
structure, I presume. So you recycle, and that's a great thing.
Yeah, absolutely. We have no shareholders to answer to, and which is nice. And so we're strictly looking out for investing, reinvesting, and continuing to kind of grow the pyramid of investments that we have.
Yeah. And Rajiv, what's your sort of perspective and what's your sort of time horizon?
I say, Jason, based on some of the comments you made earlier and we've been discussing, I think this traditional notion of a preclinical phase 1, 2, 3, and then kind of a linear risk spectrum that's correlated to the phase, I think is really an old model, so defunct. I think risk is more fundamentally driven by causation and fundamental biological insight and confidence to be able to drug that particular mechanism in a safe and effective way and be best of class. And I don't know what you'd call it. Maybe I get it, I see it moment, and it could be anywhere along that whole spectrum of drug development. And so I think that's how I like to think about the starting point. With the caveats, the companies need to be well funded, management team, clinical trial, all that stuff. But in most of I think the exciting investments we made in the last 2 decades, there's been this moment, okay, I see it. Okay, I see it. I see the kinases coming to life, and I think we could drug them safely and get targeted medicines, and then get Loxo taken out and array, and big pharma begins to see it maybe a little bit later. So I'd say the starting point is that I see it moment. And then for me, in an ideal state at least, if I can indulge that for a moment, I think it's like I'd never want to get out of these companies, because if you look at Genentech, I mean, I use this as an example. Genentech came public for the second time in 2000 at a $5 billion valuation. In 2009, Roche bought it for $100 billion valuation. Celgene, I was fortunate enough to see that company at a $300 million valuation before Revlimid. The IMiDs as a class, Thalidomide had a history associated with, no one wanted to invest in the company, and just began to understand the applications in myeloma and broadly in other diseases, and the mechanistic validation, and be able to engineer the mechanism to create the better next generation molecules. And Bristol bought it, 20 years later at, I think it was an 80 billion, what was the last valuation on Celgene. But my point here is that when you find these really great biotech companies, the industry goes from becoming among the worst businesses in the world. If you think about it from like a broad kind of investment stock market perspective, they're the worst in the sense because they burn a lot of cash. The probability of success for most companies in the sector in the early stage is very low. It's highly competitive. You need regulatory approvals, and you're in an environment where nobody wants to pay for these. It's not clear what the values medicines are to society. I hope that changes at some point too. But so they go, I think, from this worst business model to among the best business models in the world. When you have proof of concept and you have that translation in the clinic, and people say, "Wow, this drug is now going to really transform patients' lives," payers can justify paying for it because they're saving dollars within the healthcare system. As a global market, you have 15 years of exclusivity. It's very difficult for somebody to copy that. So high barriers to entry, very high margins. And that becomes like the best business in the world. And I think the examples I gave you, over a 20-year, 10-year, 20-year period, like Genentech, Celgene, for example, others, many others, amongst some of the best investments you can make anywhere in the world in any stock market. So that's why in my mind, and I always have this thing, it's like, I want to kind of start at that moment of like, okay, I see it, to like essentially own it forever. And I think generally these companies get bought out, the best ones get taken out. In the last 12 months, we've got Principia, Momenta, Medicines Company, Array, Loxo. They're all, all very, very targeted next generation drug development companies based on some of the themes we talked about. And I think pharma just recognizes the value of that. And that hopefully should also translate to higher probability of success, better patient outcomes, so more value to society and payers. And that's generally been the way these companies have exited, but I would like to own them forever because, hopefully we're still at the beginning of the biotech century. And, the regenerative medicine hasn't even really started at this point as yet, but all the forces that you can begin to see that in the next few years, next 3 years, 5 years, 10, 20 years, all the forces coming together of really understanding the complex, intricate intracellular structures of all these different cell types that we have, all of us have billions of them, just being able to tease out the different elements of that, be able to engineer around them, understand functionality, structure, and start getting the technological tools to do it rapidly and then drug it. You can see a very optimistic, a great future for regenerative medicine. So, that's why I'm optimistic in terms of my kind of like, I want to own them forever statement.
Right. I
It's
share
nice
your
to have somebody. It's nice to have somebody in your position with your passion too, Rajiv.
Absolutely. No, and I share your optimism. I think we are very early in the biotech century, and the industry from a technological point of view is still relatively early in comparison to the tech world. Right? It used to be not that long ago in biotech, if you had a novel target you wanted to go after with an antibody, you had to invent an antibody platform before you could make that one drug. And that's where a lot of the high fixed cost expense and risk came from. If you want to write an app for an iPhone, you write the app. You don't have to invent the iPhone or chips or invest in a fab. And we're not yet at the iPhone stage of things in biotech, but nor are we at this kind of one-off. You've got to build a whole factory to make one product, phase of things. And, from an Atlas perspective, as we look back historically, our exits are split almost exactly 50-50 M&A versus IPO. And as with your Exonics example, we're very happy to see companies that are innovative companies end up in larger companies with the resources and vision and time horizon and capital to continue to pursue them. And the other half of the companies go public, and we're very happy to see them with access to the public markets and to build forward independently. Of course, many of them, as Rajiv was describing it, are acquired as public companies. And one statistic that I've always thought is very interesting, there's this very virtuous kind of cycle in the public biotech markets, where if you look at all of the dollars, this is true at least over the past 7 or 8 years, that go into biotech IPOs, they're less than the money that's returned to biotech investors from M&A. And so when we think about what all the changes have been in the capital markets for biotech over the past decade, that's one of the key ones. Companies are now making it from early discovery stage into, at least mid-cap, if not large cap, public companies. In many cases, Celgene, you name it, commercial companies. They're selling products. They're not just science-based. And then they're then acquired and are able to recycle that money. And that's in some ways, I think, the CureDuchenne venture model, writ large in the public markets. That's how recycling works at that end of the spectrum. And, it's a very positive thing. One thing I thought we might touch on, we just have a few more minutes, very briefly, and not at all meant to be put in a controversial way, but I think that there's been a very positive evolution of the regulatory setting over there. We'll just call it the past decade as well for the biopharma space, where certainly from my perspective, we can put aside the current, hopefully short-lived controversy potentially around COVID vaccines, but the regulatory agencies have been very, very science-driven. So they're neither kind of allies of the industry, nor are they antagonistic to the industry. They're driven by science and what the best way to move these products forward is. And I think that kind of, what I will describe as a sort of innovative and flexible but science-based regulatory environment, I think is very important for these rare diseases and regenerative medicine. And maybe if it's not too hot a topic, you guys could each comment on that briefly.
Right. So obviously, when you have a child dying of a rare disease, you consider that to be an emergency, as much so as COVID is an emergency. And if you add up all the children with rare diseases in this country, it's a significant amount that I think it should be considered an emergency. And so I actually was on a panel with Peter Marks from FDA and Chris Austin from NIH. And the topic was, how do we translate lessons learned from the COVID pandemic to rare diseases? Because there are a lot of lessons, and a lot has to do with relaxing some regulations, not lowering standards, but figuring out better ways to go about things. And so it's something that I'm very passionate about. And as a mom, I mean, that's when the mom of me comes out. And I think that we do need to keep the pressure on regulators to make sure that the genie doesn't go back in the bottle once we have the vaccine, and to make sure that we take these lessons learned and we can apply them to, patient populations that are going to need these, forever. And so this is not just an acute situation we have, but we have a long-term chronic situation with rare diseases. So they're actually they're listening a lot, and I think we're going to make some good inroads.
Debra, I would just applaud what you're saying and what the work that, CureDuchenne's and that you've done and with your entire team. And again, I think it's helping the community, the Duchenne's community, but it's having a major impact across the whole biotech sector, other rare diseases, and more broadly, I think a major impact on polygenic common diseases. And I think it's, your voice is being heard by a lot of these regulators, and I hope that continues to be the case when they make these risk-benefit decisions on how to, in some cases, the science is not always black and white. Some cases, it has to be this kind of risk-benefit assessment that needs to be done. So having the patient interest at the center of this discussion is always really important. And the many drugs that get lost in the regulatory jargon and technical aspects of approvals. So especially for serious diseases, this is a very, very important thing. And it's really been a new development, I think, at the FDA, and I applaud them too, in the last decade, where they've really reached out to patient groups and moms to get input on how to get the best drugs, to the patients.
And maybe
I think the agency has over 80 breakthrough, and what's the latest number for breakthrough approvals? I mean, the FDA has done a great job in that respect. And again, I would echo Deborah's point here. There's 600,000 Americans that die of cancer every year. There's 15 million Americans, alive with cancer today. And, I hope that the one silver lining from this COVID situation is just highlighting the unmet need in all these other areas, and the investment and the resources that we've dedicated globally to solving this major problem can also now be harnessed and become a model to tackle some of these other really big problems, even bigger, I would say, that affect all of us. And so, my optimistic self feels that could really, from the challenges we're facing as a society, that could really be a very positive outcome in the next few years.
I agree.
Investing and making advances in new therapies for some of these other major areas of unmet medical need.
Yeah, I think it's a very nice optimistic note, maybe for us to wrap things up on, which, we've been talking about the tremendous innovation around science and the role of patients in new therapeutic development, and the tremendous innovation that's really occurred over the past couple of decades that I think has really been mirrored by, and maybe there's a chicken and the egg aspect that we see in the capital markets on the investing side that we've been talking about as well. And of course, we're in a very unusual business because we're not making widgets, we're making therapeutics for people, for patients. And maybe the note we'll end on is I think that this panel has been a very nice, for me, sort of encapsulation of the kind of community approach that everyone takes in the biopharma space. You know, it's an industry and there are competitive aspects, but certainly in my experience, and I'm sure at the risk of speaking for you guys and yours as well, that everyone who's involved in this industry is really interested in creating new therapeutics for patients and families. So I think with that, thank you very much both for joining this virtual panel. People seem to be pretty good at Zoom and the virtual thing these days, so I think it went well. And thank you to our audience out there. And I look forward to seeing you both in person, hopefully sooner than later.
Hopefully soon. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.